Hi everyone, and welcome back. We are joined today by Jeffrey Sachs to discuss the wider conflict between the West and Russia. So welcome back to the program.
Great to be with you, Glenn.
So the United States and Russia appears to be moving toward a common understanding of how to end the war. So there's a recognition that the root causes of the war has to be resolved, which is why Trump now walked away from the ceasefire. Yet there's also talk about something like Article 5 type security guarantees for Ukraine, which makes me wonder that, well, perhaps Trump doesn't understand the root cause of the war. Anyways, I just want to get your opinions on what is your main takeaway from these recent diplomatic developments. That is, what's needed for peace, and is this possible?
I think the big advance actually is that Trump and therefore the American side, the American negotiators, have said explicitly that this will be a peace agreement, not a ceasefire. That forces the United States and Russia and eventually Europe to actually look at what peace means. It requires an understanding of the deeper causes of this conflict, the essential role that the NATO enlargement played. And I think it's moving in the right direction with a lot of obfuscation and foot dragging, because in part it exposes what this has been about, and that exposure is uncomfortable for the United States and for Europe. It basically says that this war was an unnecessary set of provocations from the West, not the unprovoked war of aggression by Russia. Well, that's a big admission to make. It's a big change of view to swallow, but I think we're getting there. Unfortunately, before getting there, the war continues. It takes too much time to arrive at conclusions that you and I and many others have arrived at years ago. This war could have ended. Of course, it could have been avoided entirely, and it could have ended at the negotiating table on better terms for Ukraine than today, as of April 2022. But that option was turned down by the United States and UK, but especially the United States. So here we are. Now, the specifics are still to be worked out, and that is taking time. Surely there will not be a NATO-like guarantee for Ukraine. That is tantamount to inviting a war between Russia and NATO. Russia's not going to agree to that. The United States and Europe should not agree to that. It's too easy to get drawn back into conflict or into an even escalated conflict. What does security, therefore, mean for Ukraine? It's a good question, and we should ask that directly. In my view, history and logic shows that Ukraine's real security is neutrality, that is security in and of itself, in fact, because the history of Europe, it's a long history, but even the history of post-World War II is that countries that were neutral remain neutral and basically unbothered by the Soviet Union or by Russia or by the Cold War or by the post-Cold War Cold War. In other words, countries that were neutral, like Sweden and Finland, which chose for wrong reasons recently to end their long neutrality, were not bothered by the Soviet Union or by Russia. Austria is my favorite case because it was an explicit design that Austria would become neutral in 1955. The Soviet troops would leave, and I think it's right to say the Soviet Union never bothered Austria again, nor did Russia bother Austria. So we exaggerate the need for boots on the ground or Article 5 like guarantees, neutrality is desirable for both sides of a conflict. In other words, Ukraine being in the middle but neutral is by itself a major guarantee, because both sides have an incentive to leave well enough alone so that neither is bothered by the other. And it was exactly undermining neutrality that led to the war in the first place. A second point is that Russia has proposed, and I think there's a very logical and reasonable way to do it, that Russia is one of the guarantors of peace because it's got security interests that need to be respected alongside Ukraine. The logical place for a real security arrangement is the UN Security Council. That automatically brings in the US, UK, and France, but also Russia and China. And it brings the public exposure and the ways to monitor an agreement. Now, we all know it's not perfect, but this is a way, I think, to make very clear what is agreed, to have independent monitoring. And in our world, that is pretty good and probably the best that should be aimed at, in fact, rather than tripwires and mechanisms that one way or another lead to war by accident or by machination or by false flags or by miscalculations. All of this is to say this security arrangement issue is solvable. It is not a breakpoint of the negotiations. It should not be used in a way to try to break the negotiations similarly. So if we get down to work and have some practical solutions in an arrangement that is monitored and blessed by the UN Security Council, this war can end very quickly.
It is strange to see the recognition that NATO is the source of the conflict, but yet they envision a role for NATO as the solution. But this root causes of a more durable peace, it's based on the recognition, though, that Ukraine is a mere symptom of a wider conflict, which is the lack of a mutually acceptable post-Cold War settlement, which has plagued us now for 30 years building up to this war. Now, we actually had agreements for an inclusive, indivisible security architecture that abides by the principle of indivisible security, in which we would then also consider Russia's security concern. But I guess this is where NATO came in, because instead of pursuing this indivisible security, we went with hegemonic peace, which entails expanding NATO. Now, at some levels, I'm still questioning the willingness, even from Washington, to actually reconsider the entire hegemonic system. So I wanted to ask you therefore about the origin as well. I mean, you were there in the early 1990s. You were advising not just Poland, but also Gorbachev, Yeltsin. What was the mindset and strategy of the United States for this post-Cold War order?
Yes, and as I answer that, let me say that this question goes back to 1945, not only to 1991. What kind of order will there be? Will it be collective security, or will it be a bloc security and the U.S. attempt at hegemonic security? Well, back in 1990, 91, 92, events were revolutionary. Of course, actually, let me start it in 1989. Gorbachev, the president of the Soviet Union, unilaterally ended the Cold War by saying that the Warsaw Pact military alliance would be dissolved. But more than that, and I was a direct witness to it, Gorbachev orchestrated the end of one-party rule in Eastern Europe. He brokered the deal that led to Poland's first post-communist government in the summer of 1989. He called the communist president, Jaruzelski, and said, take in that solidarity movement into your government. Absolutely extraordinary. He was offering a true peace. He was offering a peace from Rotterdam to Vladivostok, as it was described at the time, or a common European home. I was an advisor. I was absolutely smitten with this vision of a peace that would extend from Rotterdam to Vladivostok. There's no doubt that Gorbachev meant it, and there's no doubt that the West prevaricated. What happened is that Gorbachev made unilateral concessions. Immediately with the fall of the Berlin Wall, Chancellor Helmut Kohl called for reunification of Germany. This brings us to this point that the questions really start in 1945 because there was no treaty to end World War II, and Germany became divided until 1990. When German reunification was raised, that was the moment of setting a new architecture for European security, a collective security. And in the context of German reunification, the United States and Germany promised Gorbachev in February 1990 and many, many, many times onward that NATO would not enlarge eastward. In other words, that the peace and the German reunification would not take advantage of the Soviet Union or compromise Soviet security. This was key. Gorbachev said this is essential, and the point was made. One can watch the tapes or look at documents, and I always encourage people to look for themselves at something called the National Security Archive of George Washington University, in a file called What Did Gorbachev Hear? Gorbachev heard an earful that NATO would not enlarge. And this was the basis for reaching the 4+2 agreement that reunified Germany in 1990, and that in essence ended World War II. It sounds strange that World War II was ended 45 years later, but there was no peace treaty after World War II. Now, the United States almost immediately cheated afterwards, because when the Soviet Union dissolved in December 1991, and again, I was there in the Kremlin as that happened, in fact, Yeltsin said the same thing as the successor state. We want peace, we want cooperation, we count on the West as a peaceful partner. But as soon as the Soviet Union was dissolving, the United States pursued an extension of the Cold War. This is the point. The Cold War did not end from the Western point of view. It did in surface rhetoric, but immediately the security state in the United States started to plan NATO enlargement. And by 1994, it was official U.S. policy. And in 1997, in a paper for Foreign Affairs magazine by Zbigniew Brzezinski, called A Geostrategy for Eurasia, Brzezinski lays out the U.S. strategy, including the expansion of NATO to Ukraine by around 2010, discussed in the article. And the article explains that the point is to weaken Russia, even to divide it into a set of loose confederacies, part of a confederation. Brzezinski talks about Russia basically dissolving from a unitary state into three pieces: a European Russia, a Siberian Russia, and a Far Eastern Russia, linked together in a loose confederation that would have no imperial power, Brzezinski says. But this was Brzezinski as the Polish-American anti-Russian patriot in his wish list that the Cold War would continue onward to the point of the disintegration of Russia. And NATO enlargement would be the linchpin of that. And surrounding Russia in the Black Sea, meaning that Ukraine and Georgia, Romania and Bulgaria would join Turkey as Black Sea nations that would surround Russia and therefore surround Russia's naval fleet. So this story actually goes back to, yes, 1991, to promises unfulfilled by the West of no NATO enlargement. But if I could, Glenn, I'd like to go back to 1945, just very briefly. There was no peace treaty at the end of World War II. In fact, by the summer of 1945, both the UK and the US were already gearing up for a possible war against their ally, wartime ally, the Soviet Union. This is the most incredible fact, that a military alliance that had defeated Hitler, in which the Soviet Union had suffered 27 million deaths, broke apart within weeks of the end of World War II, with Churchill asking his war command about the possibility of continuing the war against the Soviet Union. They said no, not a good idea. And the US military already foreseeing, within weeks of the surrender of Germany, the possibility or even likelihood of war with the Soviet Union by the early 1950s. And because of that vision by the US and UK in 1945, in my view, the post-war turned into a Cold War rather than into a peacetime, because the peaceful approach to ending the war, which would have been the neutrality of Germany, of post-Hitler Germany, was blocked by the Western powers. The West said, no, Germany is divided into four parts, the four occupying powers. Three of them, the Western side, will form the Federal Republic of Germany, and it will be remilitarized. And by 1955, it would join the new NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization alliance. So the West turned down the idea, raised repeatedly by the Soviet Union, of a demilitarized and neutral Germany as the key to a peace agreement in Europe. This was raised by the Soviet Union in 1945. It was raised again by Stalin in 1952. It was proposed again in the context of the Austrian neutrality in 1955. But at all points, the West said, no, we will remilitarize our part of Germany. NATO will be our defense bloc. We will not have a neutral Germany in the center of Europe. To my mind, of course, this is heatedly debated among those historians that look at this. To my mind, this was the lost opportunity to avoid a Cold War, to avoid a harsh peace, and one that nearly brought us to nuclear war on several occasions after World War II. And it was the chance to overcome that again in 1990 with German reunification. NATO could have been dissolved, should have been dissolved. At least it should not have moved 1 inch eastward. But we did in 1990, 91, 92, the same thing that the West did in 1945, that hegemonic idea. It's a British idea, ultimately, not a U.S. idea. The U.S. learned it from Britain. But it's ultimately, we don't accept peace as equals. We must be hegemonic. And that idea, I think, was the basis of the Cold War, and then the basis of the post-1991 system. And it's what's in part on the table today. So the question is, can the United States accept a post-hegemonic system? Globally, probably not yet. Within Europe, probably yes, vis-a-vis Ukraine. But this is really what's on the table right now, in my view. We've never gotten over 80 years of the ultimate British idea which became the American idea that peace through hegemony.
Yeah, it's kind of amazing that the British strategy they all planned, they called it operational unthinkable, in which immediately after the war was over, they were planning an attack on the Soviet Union, surprise attack on their ally on the 1st of July of 45, that is right after the war, and consisting then of American, British, and also what remains of Nazi Germany's army, so using their eminent soldiers as well. It's kind of extraordinary that this would be the plan. But it kind of begs the question, therefore, to what extent do you think the Washington is prepared for peace? Because I hear that they talk about ending the Ukraine war, but I don't hear anyone recognizing basic Russian security concerns. I hear no one talking about a common peace. I hear no speak of indivisible security, where we recognize that all sides have to be have the security concerns met. Instead, the rhetoric appears to be we lost Ukraine, but then that doesn't mean abandoning hegemony. That suggests a temporary ceasefire would do. So I also don't see anyone walking away from the idea that controlling Crimea and the Black Sea is ultimate goal. Recently, General Donahue, he argued that NATO has plans for and has been training for invading Kaliningrad, which not is just an attack on Russian territory, but would also put 1 million Russians under NATO occupation. But again, it's the same with China. I don't see any willingness to live side by side with the Chinese either. So it kind of begs the question, have the hegemonic peace been abandoned? If not, is a temporary peace or a temporary ceasefire all that's on the table in Ukraine?
Well, I think first to say that the low level of discussion in Washington, in Brussels, in Berlin, in London, in Paris is shocking. Where are statesmen? Where are diplomats? We don't see any of them. Just the quality of this discussion is abysmal, without any voices of inside governments, of history, perspective, of this point of view that we need to find a way to end this cycle of violence, of recognizing the choices before us. Well, if you look at the U.S. Administration, it's a gang of the rankest amateurs. There's no thinker around in Washington right now. And this counts because the level of discussion is, it's sometimes mystifying. We don't even know what the words mean. And it's not only because of obfuscation, it's because of utter confusion. Or you look at the discussion in London or Brussels, it's without even these concepts being asked or raised or debated. So I think that this is part of the story, the art of diplomacy, which is a skill. It requires knowledge, history, perspective when it's done very well, as in many examples in keeping the peace in 19th century Europe. It is the result of enormous skill and historical knowledge and perspective, and active engagement in diplomacy. None of that happens right now. Within Europe, the Russophobia is rampant and wild. The voices have been raised of the most Russophobic elements. The fact that Europe is represented by its probably single most Russophobic region, the Baltic states. One can understand in some way the Russophobia of the Baltic states, but on the other hand, one would think that there would be some perspective of prudence as well, but that's lacking. And to have Kaja Kallas from Estonia as the voice of Europe, as the High Representative Vice President for External Affairs, is truly dismaying. And to hear such simplicity and crudeness coming from Brussels is very dismaying. I should have added on that list of shocking lack of insight, of course, Germany. Merz, I couldn't imagine a government to rival how bad the Schultz period was. But Merz is actually worse. Merz shows no perspective at all. And how can it be that a Finnish president, just to add to my list of complaints, Stubb, who knows that on the basis of neutrality, as painful as Finnish history may be from Finland's perspective in World War II or vis-a-vis the Soviet Union, neutrality for Finland brought Finland to #1 in the world in world happiness and well-being. And it brought Finland to a state of peace and prosperity beyond imagining. And he can't bring himself to say anything other than continued war towards Russia. Can't explain anything about Finland's success, can't explain anything about the real history after 1944 about what neutrality means and how it can work. So we don't have anybody trying to draw positive lessons right now. This makes a difference because ideas count, and when you have a complete vacuum of thought, as we have right now, you don't make progress beyond old, failed ideas. The fact that a lot of the hegemonic tools are the toolkit of the CIA and the security agencies really hurts, because a huge amount of foreign policy of the West is like the iceberg. It's submerged below the surface. It is truly deep state operations. It's covert operations. It's regime change operations. And by the way, one piece of evidence completely in support of your proposition that the thinking hasn't changed is, even as we're trying to make peace in Ukraine, we are messing up the South Caucasus royally right now, with the United States claiming a 99-year corridor on the border of Iran. Unthinkable things that will lead to new wars through the same kind of machinations as in the past. So all of this is to say, this is the time when we should be rethinking more fundamentally the collective security, exactly where you started. Ukraine at least could push us to thinking again. It's been a long time since there's been thinking. Foreign policy in the U.S. has been on autopilot basically since the 1990s. It failed miserably. It failed Ukraine miserably. It failed Western security miserably. It failed everybody miserably. Maybe as people contemplate what does security really mean in the coming weeks, somebody will learn something from history.
I'm glad you mentioned Europeans. I just have a very brief last question before we run out of time. Is the Europeans now, not only are they opposed to Trump's peace efforts, they don't even want to talk to Russia. Is this a failure to imagine a multipolar world or to live without the United States? Or how do you make sense of refusing to end a war they're losing?
The structural problem of Europe being 27 independent countries remains unsolved. There is no clear security architecture for Europe, and the Europeans have not devised one. And the U.S. was their security blanket and their security umbrella, if you want, all this time. And so this led to an utter decline of European thinking and a simple dependency on the United States. And we don't see among any of the actors right now, Starmer or Merz or Macron or others, any leader with ideas. They're absolutely not presenting structured ideas about European security. So this is very disappointing. I think it shocks all of us who view Europe as, a very sophisticated place. This is the most unsophisticated discussions one can imagine. I would use the word primitive. And the failure of any Europeans to sit down with Russian counterparts and actually discuss these things is mind-boggling. You learn when you discuss. And meeting for the 10,000th time with Zelensky, and not once with Lavrov is the huge blunder.
Well, thank you so much for your time, and yeah, look forward to seeing you very soon in New York. So have a good
Wonderful.
one. Thank you.
We'll talk soon. Thanks a lot.